Hey everybody, this is chapter 8 of Leninism and the Traditional Regime. This is chapter 8. This is chapter 8, Leninism and the Traditional Regime of State Capitalism and World Revolution. Written by C.L.R. James, written in collaboration with Raya, Dunayevskaya, and Boggs. There remains now the summation of our theory that we consider to be Leninism for our epoch. It is best explained in terms of Leninism itself in its own epoch. It is the only experience we have of the party, the plan, the state in action. During the revolution, Lenin stated that the proof that Russia was ripe for socialism was in the creation of Soviets by the proletariat, the creation of a historic organization for the expression of its creative energies. If the Soviets had not been created, Lenin would have held to his old doctrine of the bourgeois revolution. Lenin complained in the first years of the revolution that the workers were not administering the state. Lenin complained that the state was bureaucratically deformed and called upon the party to assist the working class to be able to defend itself against its own state. Lenin, at a certain stage in the Russian Revolution, stated that the party was not controlling the state, was not controlling the state, and the state was running away with them, and he didn't know where this monstrosity was going. Today we know, or ought to know. Lenin warned the country and the party that the few communists in Russia were lost amid the vast number of bourgeois functionaries of the old regime. Lenin recognized the need for individual management in the sense of petty bourgeois functionaries and subordination in industry to a single will. But Lenin drew a harsh line between the proletariat and the Bolshevik party on the one hand, and those whom the Stalinists and Titoists call the, quote, socialist intelligentsia, end quote. In left-wing communism, Lenin pointed out that absolutely the most difficult task of all for the proletariat and its party was the conversion of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia into loyal and disciplined servants of the proletariat state. The petty bourgeoisie, to whose individualism Lenin referred in 1920 as being in direct opposition to the aims and methods of the proletariat, is today infinitely more dangerous. The petty bourgeois has transformed his individualism into, quote, collectivism, end quote, which he understands to be statified production, administration, and plan, and is now the firm ally of the labor bureaucracy of capital, the plan, against the revolutionary proletariat. The essence of Leninism may be summed up as follows. 1. The state was necessary for the destruction of the exploiters, but this state was a danger to the proletariat. It was the task of the party to protect the proletariat against the state and, quote, to utilize state measures for the purpose of protecting the material and spiritual interests of the entirely organized proletariat from the state, end quote. 2. The backwardness of the Russian economy and the predominance of the peasantry imposed upon Russian production the necessity for leadership of technicians, bureaucrats, planners, etc. But in the same way that the proletariat had to be protected against its own state, the proletariat had also to be protected against the necessary bureaucracy. This was the beginning and end of Leninist policy. You understand nothing about the Russian Revolution and the problems of the proletariat, the party, and the state unless you understand this. These were the problems that could be resolved only by merging them into the world, and particularly the European Socialist Revolution. Lenin always sought for initiative. It was initiative which he sought in 1921 by the new economic policy, and to the very last in his insistence on the significance of cooperatives. The following quotation exemplifies how he proposed to struggle against the dangers that threaten the Soviet order. Quote, "We possess profound sources of strength, a broad and deep reservoir of human material, such as is not possessed and never will be possessed by any bourgeois government. We have material upon which we can draw ever more deeply, by passing from the advanced workers not only to the average workers, but even lower to the toiling peasants, to the poor and poorest peasants. Comrades from Petrograd were recently saying that Petrograd has given all its political workers and cannot give more. But when this critical hour struck, Petrograd, as Comrade Zinoviev justly remarked, proved magnificent. It seemed to be a city which is giving birth to new forces. Workers who appeared to be below the average level, who had no state or political experience whatsoever, rose to their full height and provided numerous forces for propaganda, agitation, and organization, and performed miracle after miracle. Our source of miracles is still very great," end quote. It should be noted that the proletarian revolts, in response to that last quote from Lenin, it should be noted that the proletarian self-activity manifested in the early months of 1921 was repressed by the Bolshevik government and is one of the impetuses for the Kronstadt uprising in 1921. Again, check out Matthew Quest's piece on the historical problems with C.L.R. James's interpretation of Lenin. So, end of the Lenin quote, back to the text proper. This is the Johnson Forest tendency speaking. Again. This is the Leninist policy, the basic policy which applies to every question of transitional regime. The concrete circumstances will differ, but the less powerful the situation of the proletariat, the more necessary, particularly after 30 years, becomes the Leninist policy. This is the decisive test, and not abstract arguments about whether the country is ready for socialism. The application of this Leninist policy is not a question for the future, after the difficulties of the transitional regime had been solved. It is the first step of revolutionary policy from the very beginning, from the moment of the conquest of power. This was Lenin's conception of the transitional regime, and this is what Trotsky, quoting Lenin on the struggle against officialdom, described as Lenin's policy. Quote, "You must not think that Lenin was talking about the problems of a decade. No, this was the first step with which, quote, we should and must begin upon achieving a proletarian revolution," end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. This also is the reason for Lenin's emphasis on the world proletariat. To anybody who saw the proletariat as Lenin did in relation to its own proletarian state and its own bureaucracy, the revolution of the proletariat in the advanced countries was an imperative necessity. The idea that the Yugoslav leaders are going to learn from books that the world revolution is necessary, which they didn't know before, illuminates what Orthodox Trotskyism thinks of the theory of socialism in a single country. If the Yugoslav leaders saw the proletariat with the eyes of those trying to lead the workers' state in relation to the rest of the population, not books, but the necessity of preserving the workers' state would have driven them to the world revolution long before the break with Stalin. The Leninist policy is dialectical to the core. It is based upon a brutal recognition of the contradictions within the workers' state. It is permeated with the spirit of the revolutionary proletariat, the revolutionary mobilization of the masses against the bourgeoisie in the first stage. Then, when the workers' state had been established to protect against the inevitable encroachments and invasions by its own state, the independence and creative initiative of the proletariat, which had begun by creating the Soviets. Lenin's master of dialectic, his conviction that socialism could be created only by an emancipated proletariat, enabled Lenin to discover the contradiction and outline revolutionary policy when the majority of his colleagues, it is clear, had no conception that such a contradiction could exist. Today there is no excuse. The maturity of state capitalism has brought the contradiction which Lenin sensed into the open. This dominates our epoch. Without the Leninist conception thoroughly mastered, you end in active, uncritical support of bureaucratic administrative. You end in the active, uncritical support of the bureaucratic, administrative, one-party state. The proof is Yugoslavia.